Hello, thank you for joining me. See, in this film we're going to talk a little bit more about splines in regard to our revolve feature and how we can manipulate those. We're not going to go through all the options in regard to splines, but we are going to add some or play around with it a little bit and kind of show you what the results are. With enough information, you can probably get out there and probably play around with a little bit more on some of the additional options. One thing to keep in mind about splines in regard to revolve features, splines work really well in regard to doing surfacing. As I mentioned in class, surfacing is a toolbar used that you can demonstrate for your final project if you want to explore that. A lot of surfacing is driven by splines like you see here. And there's a lot of work can go into the splines that you're creating here in order to make them fairly even and very nice in the way of transitional curves and stuff like that. So let's go ahead and do this. What I want to do is I want to do an offset of this line. One nice thing about being able to offset a spline is that offset line in regard to that spline will retain that original characteristics of the line. So if you make modifications to the spline, it'll also make those modifications to the offset. So the offset will always be at a specific distance that you initially choose. But I do want to offset this spline, but what I don't want to do is offset this whole spline. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the spline off from the top up here by using my trim tool, and I'm going to redraw another spline in its place. So we'll start from that point, and little pony line there. We'll start from that point. Carefully draw that out and exaggerate that a little bit, maybe go up a little bit at first. We're going to approach this line, but we're not really going to touch it, but that's going to be the maximum extent of our wine glass. And then as we get up towards the top, this other vertical line is going to define the extent of our necking of the top of the wine glass, so it kind of goes in a little bit. When you're all done with your spline, go to end spline, and kind of cleans it up a little bit. And yeah, what we have down here is a curvature that's not very attractive. That kind of approaches it being attractive, but there are things that we can do to do these two splines that meet at that point in order to make it a little bit more readable and usable. One thing you might want to do is right click on that spline and go to show curvature combs. Curvature combs allow you to see what the curves are doing in a much more visibly graphic way. We can change our scale on the combs. We're making them bigger by going over to our properties manager over here, and the density of the combs, we can increase and decrease that so we can see what it's doing. So if you look at this essentially, on the outside of the curve is where you have the comb. So the comb defines whether you're on the outside or inside of the curve, and the more of a sharper radius in that area of that curve, the longer the combs are going to be. So that's how it graphically represents that curve. So you notice that the comb, when it comes down to this point down here, it actually goes negative. It creates a little bit of a dimple. We can correct that by taking that point and maybe moving it out. So now that the combs are always going to be on the outside down here, but they kind of vary a little bit. It gets really strong here, it gets very diminutive there, and again, these things can be changed and moved. One thing that you can do, as I mentioned in the previous films, is move around these poles over here in order to influence that point and how the curves look at that point. And it looks like the maximum curve is really close to where that point is. If I move that point in a little bit, it does change that curvature a little bit. So this is kind of the things, some of the things you go through when you put splines in there. If you really want to perfect or get something that looks very, very reasonable, you probably want to play around with these points and the poles and the angles of those poles, and try to get something that looks really good. So let's look not only at curvature combs, and we're going to turn them on in this one too so we can see what it looks like. This kind of looks like a dinosaur with that arch back over there. But let's take this line and this line and apply a condition there. We're going to put a sketch entity there. There's two choices we have. We could do tangent, which just kind of applies that this line is going to come in and add a smooth tangency to that line. But the curvature on it's really kind of dorked out here. It really takes a kind of a spin for the worse there. So let's go ahead and delete that and put in something that actually helps improve the curvature on this. It's kind of like it improves upon the tangent relationship. And that is equal curvature. Equal curvature also puts in a tangency in there. But with equal curvature, you have a little bit more in the way of options here. You do have this pole here which increases or decreases the influence at that point. You also have these other poles in here in regard to the tangency that we put in there that can also be manipulated. So in regard to this line here, the poles down here are going to be perpendicular to that point up here. So as you get close to that, you can actually manipulate it and move that around. As you get further away, the ability to be able to rotate that diminishes. So in regard to these black lines here, in regard to the pole, what that means is that it is fixed to the spline. Although the spline is blue, these lines mean that the angle of this and the length of this cannot move in regard to the spline that's in there. But if you move the spline, those lines move too. So in a way, it's kind of a relative reference. So I'm not going to show you any more about equal curvature or tangencies here. We're going to keep the tangency, but probably get rid of the equal curvature and kind of play around with our wine glass just a little bit more. I'm going to leave that up to you to explore and play around with. Maybe find some additional online resources. But we are going to at least get the tangency in there so we can see what it looks like. And probably smooth that out a little bit by moving our points around and make it a little bit more user-friendly. And then once we do that, we're going to go ahead and do an offset of our spline on top to get the inside of the wine glass, kind of finish that up. And then we'll take a look at how that looks and an ultimate rendering of this model in the next film.